I returned recently to Iraq. I'd been here before, in 2003, working as a British diplomat and as the deputy governor of 2 Iraqi provinces.
From this day is the real beginning of the transition to a free, independent Iraq.
Talking to American soldiers, I've been intrigued to find that before they're posted to the Middle East, officers are made to study one of my boyhood heroes. In World War I, Lawrence of Arabia united feuding Arab tribes into a formidable army which helped to topple the Ottoman Turkish Empire. His experience of defeating a foreign military occupation, of leading an insurgency, has led to him being held up as the man who cracked fighting in the Middle East. So today, his writings and thought have become a guide to the US military and its allies, fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan.
One of the key things that you could take away from Colonel Lawrence is he had an appreciation and knew the people. There's just incredible and valuable lessons that we have taken from that.
But for me, Lawrence has a much darker message. Lawrence might have won a war, but the politics that followed fatally undermined his success. He aimed, he said, to write his will across the skies and build a new, independent Arab nation. But in these 2 films, I want to show how Lawrence felt. His dream ended in catastrophe and shame. And I believe that if our generals and politicians now could see what Lawrence saw, we would not be in the mess that we're in today. For 3 years, I've been based in Afghanistan, working with a community to save and restore part of the old city of Kabul. But at the same time, not far south of the capital, there's war between the Taliban and Western armies. I struggle to reconcile this conflict with all that I find so positive and entrancing about the cultures of the Middle East, all that I've seen in the last 10 years that I've spent living and working in this region. And in Lawrence, I've found a man who experienced and understood many of these same issues. Reading Lawrence has taught me much about the risks and challenges of trying to intervene in a culture that is so alien to your own. Lawrence, the warrior hero, started life a long way from the deserts of Arabia. Born in 1888 in a middle-class suburb of Oxford, he eventually went to Oxford University. When I myself was at Oxford, I often thought about Lawrence, about how a shy, reserved boy began, before the age of 18, to prepare himself to be a leader.
You have to think yourself back to that period when Britain was an imperial power, when young middle-class Englishmen and upper-class Englishmen were being brought up to run the empire.
Jeremy Wilson is T. Lawrence's authorized biographer.
He had a very, very profound sense of right and wrong. I think that just shows through everything he does. I think that aspect of Lawrence must have formed really quite early on. Lawrence had certain gifts. He was able to manipulate people extraordinarily well, and to manipulate people extraordinarily well, you must have an ability to size them up almost instantly. But it's a gift, that business of being able to put people in your pocket. It's a mixture of charm, it's a mixture of analysis, of hunch.
For me, there's another vital clue in Lawrence's early years. that hints at his desire to change history. Lawrence seemed to his schoolteachers a relatively ordinary, if eccentric, bookish boy. But there was something very strange about his interests. He was obsessed with knights in shining armor. He cycled around the country doing brass rubbings of crusading heroes because he wanted to emulate them, he wanted to compete with them. He wanted some of the glory of being a knight in shining armor. Lawrence was not an accidental hero. He was someone who set out quite deliberately to become a hero. In 1909, when he was 21, Lawrence walked 1,000 miles across Syria and the Middle East. A tough and dangerous journey during which he studied Crusader castles for his university thesis. He began in Constantinople, then the capital of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and walked right down into Ottoman Syria. It was on this trip that Lawrence discovered the landscape and, more importantly, the people that came to dominate his life. Lawrence spent a lot of time walking through the Middle East. He was often doing 9-10 hours a day across the landscape of Syria and Palestine. Every night he was staying in a different village hut, sometimes in a Bedouin tent, and they'd never take any payment for it. He was a kind of wandering mascot, I suppose, or must have seemed to them, this blonde English boy in his formal British clothes. Sometimes he'd aim for a Crusader castle, but often he'd be sitting in a tent on a village floor, listening to people talk about their lives, talk about the government. By the end of it, the shy young undergraduate in Oxford had found himself. I can relate to Lawrence's experience. I walked from Turkey to Bangladesh when I was 26, which took me about 21 months, and I walked about 6,000 miles. And I stayed in about 500 village houses on the way. These are random places that just happen to be 20 or 25 miles apart. I walked across Afghanistan shortly after the fall of the Taliban, through villages 10 days' walk from the nearest road. I had some difficult experiences. The man on my right in this photograph tried to shoot me for a bet. But Afghans, in their dignity, taught me a great deal about how to live a meaningful life, and they protected me. I found when I returned to the government, when I returned to working with the Foreign Office and with the military in Iraq, that I'd learnt an enormous amount. The fact that these communities are extremely generous, often very honor-led, but also surprisingly conservative, religious, anti-foreign. I think there are elements of emotional, spiritual motivation in this. My sense that I'd left a line of footprints for 6,000 miles behind me across Asia. And also, I think, certainly for Lawrence, walking through the Holy Land, an echo of the Crusades, of the disciples of Christ walking across the Holy Land. He arrived here in June 1909, the Syrian castle of Crac de Chevalier, which he called the greatest castle in the world. When Lawrence comes here as a young man, to get here at all, he needs special passports and permissions coming from Istanbul. And it's dangerous territory. Often the Ottoman police are stopping him from investigating things. And when he goes off on his own, he gets beaten up. This is contested territory even today, a central strategic point for the Knights. Lawrence's boyhood obsession, who came to conquer and hold the Holy Land for Christianity. It's a central link in a chain of castles stretching across Syria, which for 3 centuries they held against the local Muslim population. The
size of the stones, the tens of thousands of people building this building, the amount of lives, money, energy, fanaticism poured into this kind of occupation. I mean, you can sense here in Crack the Chevalier why the Crusades is such an astonishing phenomenon even today.
This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while.
And the governments of the West were responsible for what he called a crusader campaign against Muslims.
You can see why Osama bin Laden's obsessed with the Crusades, why George Bush refers to the Crusades. The scale of this occupation, the amount of investment, this isn't porter cabins and barbed wire. This is massive blocks of limestone, tens of thousands of workmen, 75 years building this castle. So Lawrence, as he's moving around, putting himself into the mindset of the people who built this castle, trying to understand how they defended themselves, is already beginning to think about the link between occupation and local populations. And the terrible tragedy, the surreal weirdness of foreigners trying to cling on to an alien land.
In Lawrence's time, of course, Syria was under another form of occupation, the rule of Ottoman Turks. Muslims, but not Arabs, ruling despotically over a vast Arab empire. Lawrence saw day by day the repression of Arab culture and sensed the Arab longing for freedom. But it was, in his word, only a dream, because their spirits were shriveled under the numbing breath of a military government. Lawrence's first job after university was in Syria, where he worked in a remote area as an archaeologist.
Archaeology was very different in the Middle East then. You had a small number of foreign archaeologists and a huge, great native workforce. And Lawrence's job was to manage that workforce. So he becomes an Arabist. He learns the language, he's immersed in the culture, he's learning about the Syrian tribes. He comes to identify very strongly with the Arab world.
Today, this team of British archaeologists are excavating the site of an old Ottoman Turkish garrison. And this thing?
That's a Mauser bullet.
So this is Turkish?
This is Turkish. That is First World War munitions. Yeah. We get lots of that.
Amazing. While Lawrence was digging ancient objects out of the ground, Europe was hurtling towards the First World War. The Ottoman soldiers that he met were not only controlling the Arab populations, they were about to ally themselves with Germany against Britain and France.
We're looking at the Ottoman Empire, a decaying empire, an empire which is under attack from other empires, other great powers, and we're also looking at an empire which faces revolt from within.
This was a fort from which the Ottomans tried to occupy a vast desert landscape and subdue the nomadic Bedouin tribes.
This is called Batn al-Ghul in Arabic, which means the belly of the beast. This is a place where you move from the relative safety of the uplands over there down into a bandit country, where the possibility of Bedouin raiding becomes a real threat. And I sometimes wonder what was going on in the minds of those Ottoman boys or Turkish boys. They found themselves in this very bleak landscape, a long way from home. They found that they were hated, they were unwelcome. It must have been as miserable as the Western Front was for British and German and French soldiers in a very different way.
You can see, just watching these men, how much Lawrence learnt from being an archaeologist, gaining a precise eye for detail, for geology, for topography, the experience of years working alongside and managing hundreds of Arab labourers.
the landscape has the same effect on a soldier as it does on an archaeologist in some ways, because it is to a soldier that comes from, say, Manchester or London, or even from, sort of Denver, Colorado. Coming out here, it is such an alien landscape, and the landscape teaches you. You can either learn from the landscape or you can fail, and if you fail, then you shouldn't be an archaeologist. It's probably the same thing with a soldier.
One of the exciting things about doing modern conflict archaeology in the Middle East is it resonates with the present. And there's a sense in which you can see in Iraq, and I think also in Afghanistan, that a modern empire, the American empire, is facing insurgency and a kind of asymmetrical warfare, which is just as difficult for the Americans and the British to deal with as the insurgency that the Ottoman Turks were facing 90 years ago, dealing with the Arabs.
By 1914, Lawrence spoke good Arabic, he'd done some remarkable journeys, and he had a real empathy for Arabic culture. And it was this that must have drawn the attention of certain departments of the British government. A few months before the beginning of the First World War, Lawrence came down this narrow lane in Marylebone to call on the Palestine Exploration Fund, an archaeological society that's virtually unchanged since Lawrence's day.
Through here, up on the coastal plain.
Yeah.
Across the border. Well, this is the frontier between British Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. The British had this area mapped as well.
But in 1914, the Palestine Exploration Fund was also doing its bit on the side for British intelligence. This is the map that results from the expedition.
This was the best map of its type for the region.
The British didn't have a decent map of the border between the Ottoman Empire and British Egypt. This would be the front line if there was a war. It protected the main lines to British India.
Allenby used this map here, and the Suez Canal is absolutely the crucial factor.
Lawrence was selected for a small team that claimed to be looking for archaeological remains of the biblical exodus from Egypt, but in fact the map served a military purpose. Suddenly he finds himself involved in this. Why is he here? What's he doing?
There was no doubt about it that this was intended as an undercover operation using an academic organisation as a front. And in fact, Lawrence jokes about being a red herring. We even have the letter that's referring to Lawrence as a young man who's quite shy but good at colloquial Arabic and gets on very well with the natives. He has, I think, more of the instincts of an explorer, but is very shy. So this is a sort of a precursor for what he's going to be doing in the revolt, where you have small teams of a few British officers, Arab supporters, on the move, being self-sufficient in a desert which is hostile. I think without the survey, Lawrence would not have been Lawrence of Arabia. I feel that fervently.
Lawrence's map covers a section of the vast Negev desert, an area that now straddles Egypt, Israel and Jordan, an area across which he would later launch his guerrilla raids. As he worked, he was undergoing a transformation. I think that can be seen in his curious reaction to his first visit to the ancient site of Petra. And it was this exactly that Lawrence saw in 1914. He came down this gorge, arrived in this open square, and there in front of him, the most astonishing 2,000-year-old temple. The Corinthian columns at the top looking as though they were carved yesterday. He'd been an archaeologist for 4 years. He loved the ancient world. He loved the Middle East. And here in Petra, you would have thought everything came together. But strangely, in his account, it's not the temple he writes about, but it's this. It's about the fact that you can only get one camel down this pass. He's beginning to think more like a general and less like a historian. After all this time digging up old objects, he was beginning to realize that it was people he was more interested in, and in this part of the world, specifically the Bedouin. But secondly, it's 1914, the First World War is coming, and Lawrence isn't just an archaeologist anymore. He's here on a new expedition, financed by the Secret Service. He's changing from being a historian into a spy. Sir Mark Allen is one of Britain's foremost Arabists. He spent more than 30 years working for the British diplomatic service in the Middle East. I asked him why the British government would take the risk of recruiting such an eccentric person.
I think when people are being recruited for public service, you're looking for conventional people who are, have got good formation, good education, going to behave themselves, fit in. But we all know that people like that can be a bit dull. And so there's another type that the magpie mind spots glittering in the hedge. A slightly unconventional, a little bit eccentric maybe, a bit too clever. And Lawrence's indifference to hierarchy, again, would have been attractive because he would have seen the world the other way about, and that would have been helpful to them. His genius, I think that's a fair word to use of Lawrence, was to see that we wouldn't make much headway with dealing with the Arabs unless one crossed the street, walked into the crowd, and really made a self-conscious attempt to understand how it looked to them. I think Lawrence is remarkable in his ability to do that, his commitment to doing that. That made Lawrence very, very unusual.
Get out! Get out! What do you think his analysis would have been of how good we are today at following through on those lessons?
He would have connected with American vision of trying to make the world a better place. And I think that he would have wept with frustration at the way things are, that these fine, wonderful, very brave, very rich, competent, powerful people just don't have the language or the experience to walk into the crowd.
When the First World War was declared, Lawrence was initially given a job not in the infantry in the trenches, but working in the map office for British intelligence. His particular focus was the Ottoman Empire, this amazing combination of Islamic sentiment and a Prussian-trained modern army. Lawrence was soon dispatched to the British Army's command centre in Cairo, the centre of their operations against the Ottoman army. And his job was to record carefully on maps the precise position of almost every Ottoman unit. He began to understand their cap badges, their specialisms, their numbers. There was almost no one in the British headquarters who could rival, by this stage, his knowledge of the tribal, religious, and racial mix of the Middle East. One of the reasons why someone like Lawrence is so successful is one of the only people who can describe the complexity of it. You start with Ansariya Muslims on the coast, then moving inwards, you've got Kurds. Next cut down, you start on the border with Arab Circassians, then you have Persian Ismailis, Maronite and Greek Christians on the coast, burst of Sunnis, some Mutawali Shia, and right out on the edge of Mosul, you have devil-worshipping Yazidis. The great Ottoman Turkish Empire faced some serious problems. It was nearly bankrupt. Its armies were weakened, but the Ottoman Sultan was still the Caliph, still the supreme leader of the Islamic world. And when he called for a jihad against the British, he risked provoking not just a revolt in Arabia, but among 100 million Muslims in British India. This threat of jihad or holy war is something we're familiar with today. But then as now, the problem was how to respond. Lawrence and his colleagues decided that the solution was to launch a counter-jihad. In order to do so, the British allied themselves with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, a descendant of the Prophet, one of the few men with the charisma and authority to stand as a real rival to the Ottoman Sultan. Hussein wanted a vast independent Arab empire after the war, and the British suggested that they would give it to him in return for his support. Hussein took the British at face value, and on the basis of what he thought was their promise, launched his revolt, his counter-jihad against the Ottoman Turks. However, this revolt got off to a very bad start. Sharif Hussein and his family were beaten again and again by the modern Turkish army. And in 1916, Lawrence was dispatched from Cairo to try to find out what was going wrong. He was going to meet the family at the center of the Arab revolt, the Emir of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, and with him his sons Ali, Abdullah, Faisal and Zayd. He was going to try to identify which one of these men could be the leader, and he was hoping that he could impress them enough to attach himself to them and at last engage with the enemy, finally fulfilling his dreams of doing something heroic in the deserts of Arabia. Which one do you want? This one? Yes.
Ali. In that time.
Okay.
Ali.
Lawrence managed to get permission to travel far into the desert, and he traveled by camel. Much more elegantly, I hope, than me. You are used to this life. You can go a very long way in the desert. You don't need too much water. You're very strong.
Yes.
But for Lawrence, it's new for him. He doesn't. And very, very hard.
He come from Great Britain to the desert.
And very...
It's big difference.
Very hard for him. So what are the different commands for the camel? For example, if you want to go faster, like that. Lawrence learned to travel astonishing distances on a camel. He was very tough. His camels were very strong, and he could travel up to 100 miles a day, a difficult feat even for some of the Bedouin.
Very good. Yeah. It's a nice camel.
Horse is more comfortable. What is the problem with fighting here for you?
The Bedouins, they know the area. Turkish, he didn't know. He didn't know. Bedouins, he knows there is waters there. And he go and he look for the waters and he drinks. And he will have waters. Turkish, he don't have it. He don't have this experience.
And also, I think maybe the people in the towns, do they support the Bedouin or they support the Osmanayin?
They support the Bedouins.
Yes. So
because they know each other.
Yeah. At last, Lawrence was no longer stuck behind a desk in Cairo with his brothers fighting in the trenches. Instead, he was on his own, riding into the desert and beginning to get acquainted again with the land that he loved. At the end of his journey was Sharif Hussein's third son, Faisal, waiting for him at Wadi Safra. And there in front of him is this man who isn't the kind of man that a British officer would expect to meet. For a start, he's clad in these elaborate robes, he has black slaves behind him, he's smoking incessantly 100 cigarettes a day, he sits up till 3:30 or 4 in the morning. I think it's Lawrence's cultural awareness which lets him see that although this man doesn't look like a British general, this is exactly the kind of man who, through his patience, his gentleness, and his family position, is going to be able to effectively lead an Arab revolt. Lawrence described it in storybook terms. As love at first sight, he wrote, "I felt at first glance that this was the man I had come to Arabia to seek." The next 2 years, Lawrence spent almost all his life living in Bedouin tents, and I'm spending a night with people whose fathers and grandfathers fought alongside Lawrence.
Jorf battle also.
And how about the Zuwaida and the Zalabani? Does he remember anything about this?
تذكر شيء عن هالكلام هذا؟
فكلهم حويطات وكلهم اشتركوا بالمعارك.
They are not حويطات.
They're not. One of the things that Lawrence says, which is something it's very difficult for me not to do, is that he believes that you shouldn't ask questions. You should spend weeks or months sitting listening to people, talking about their genealogies, talking about their families, before you ask any questions. Lawrence found the Bedouin with their courage, their violence, their hospitality, their dignity, their generosity, to be about as close as he could come in the modern world to his dream of living with, fighting with, working with medieval knights. We're sitting in the majlis, or the meeting place for Great Sheikh, and you can see in the center of the room the coffee pot, which gathers people in the evening. Looking around this room, you can see the kinds of issues he was dealing with every day. You can see first having to navigate who the most senior people in the room are. There are 3 sheikhs here from their respective tribes. The different ways in which people sit, not showing the soles of their feet, for example. You can see some people running prayer beads through their hands, which is generally a sign of piety. There are 5 people here today who are wearing pistols. And this was the kind of group that he would have been with night after night, trying to judge by looking into people's eyes who is going to be reliable, who's going to want to fight with him. It's a minefield out there, and all of it represents why what Lawrence did was so uniquely difficult. Our host's father went with Lawrence to blow up a railway station about 200 meters from here. What do people say about Lawrence as a man, as his character, as his...
شو بتعرف عن شخصية لورنس؟
بعرف إنه ضابط بريطاني خدم دولته.
Yeah.
بأخلاص.
He was an English officer who served his country for a long period of time.
وعمل على سياسة بلاده بالأخلاص.
He helped the Arabs in their revolt, especially in their bombings here in the area during the revolt.
لورنس أول إشي رجل كان صديق للعرب.
So Lawrence was a friend of the Arabs.
It's striking how, although many Arabs today are suspicious of Lawrence because of his colonial associations, these men whose fathers and grandfathers fought with him have picked up from their ancestors a sense of respect, a sense that he had a real sympathy for Arab people. But reading Lawrence's account of this time, it's also clear just how grueling he found these conditions. It's a pretty difficult night if you're not used to sleeping in these kind of conditions. Got about 40 people sleeping in the tent with you. Children coming and going. It was so cold that on certain nights they'd wake up and find 5 or 6 people had died from exposure during the night. It's very, very strange for a foreigner because you can never fully relax because it's not your own culture. And I think one of the reasons that Lawrence's nerves must have worn over a year or 18 months is that this tent is their home and they've got their wives and they've got their livestock and they've got their children, and in the evenings they can go back to them. Whereas he, every night, is working. He's looking around the room thinking, which one of you guys is going to come on a raid with me tomorrow? Is this guy who I had an argument with yesterday, is he going to fall out? But what exactly they're thinking, I don't know. This sort of life, and this is, I suppose, the end of it, you can see with these clapped-out old cars and the various bits of rubble scattered through the desert, obviously that the life is changing quite dramatically. But you feel really connection to history. The whole question of how a Westerner can operate in what will feel like a very alien environment, how Lawrence can be in an Arab tent in robes, drinking coffee, dealing with a very difficult language with tribal structures. All of the difficulty of that, but also perhaps even the romance of that, is something that remains pressing 80 years later for American and British troops in Iraq
Arab smiles.
So these actually, they look quite nice, huh?
Yeah.
They're quite good. Quite good
handmade,
herbs.
sir.
Yeah. But this is not actually an Arab tent. This is a shipping container. Right?
Yeah.
This is the closest they get.
Yeah.
For some of them to the real Arab world. American soldiers fighting today in the Middle East are not living night after night alone in Bedouin tents. They live a life which is both more protected and also more isolated from the local population. The great challenge for them, the reason that they read Lawrence, is to try to work out how to develop those forms of cultural sensitivity, how to leave your own culture and enter an Arab one effectively. As part of this, American officers are still encouraged to read the 27 points which Lawrence wrote as a guide for British officers 90 years ago.
Thousands of U.S. Army majors have learned the story of Lawrence, and they're also shown clips from the great movie Lawrence of Arabia.
While others travel through the earth.
There's the scene of Lawrence sitting in Faisal's tent. And of course, his superior, the British colonel, wants to get on with business, and Lawrence is listening. And he even finishes the recitation.
And surely the future shall be better for thee than the past.
And in the end shall your Lord be bounteous to thee, and thou be satisfied.
It works really well. I've seen many officers and NCOs who have been to Iraq and Afghanistan say, after you turn off the clip, say, that was exactly like any number of meetings I had. The interesting thing is that discussion didn't happen in reality, but it's okay. The movie will work as sort of a device to get them to think about Lawrence.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you open this book with Lawrence's articles. On the first page, the American officer reading this is told, learn all you can about your tribal name and Bedou. Get to know their families, clans and tribes, friends and enemies, wells, hills and roads. Bury yourself in Arab circles. Have no interests and no ideas except the work in hand, so that your brain is saturated with one thing only and you realize your part. You don't think if you're an American officer reading that, you think, well, come on. I mean, you know, I'm not going to be able to do that.
None of them will ever be able to speak Arabic the way that Lawrence did. But still, I think the idea that Lawrence offers, the example, does resonate with some.
But there's another reason why the US military study Lawrence. He's not just a cultural anthropologist. He was, in a sense, the first foreign insurgent. He grasped instinctively how a local population could use its position and its landscape to defeat a foreign military occupation. While his brothers were fighting on the Western Front, Lawrence was immersing himself in an alien culture and learning how a very different form of religion and nationalism could be used to pioneer a new form of guerrilla warfare. Normally, looking at a landscape like this, you just give up, because everything you would be taught at Staff College, if you're a British officer, would tell you that this landscape's a waste of time. An army marches on its stomach, you've got to supply it. There's no way of getting food this far into the desert. There's no water to keep people. So what's remarkable about Lawrence is that he sees all those things, all those negative things, are in fact advantages. Because this is going to be a problem for the Turks, but it's not going to be so much of a problem for the Bedouin. The Bedouin have lived here. The Bedouin can move 200 miles through this without needing water. This is, of course, the landscape that you can see in parts of Iraq, in parts of southern Afghanistan. And it's a landscape which is very, very difficult for a large army to move through. Armies are very dependent on roads, they're very dependent on rail networks. You can patrol this desert, but if you patrol in small numbers, you can be ambushed. And you can't garrison it because you can't resupply yourselves. So in the end, most of it is empty most of the time, and an empty space on the map is a very dangerous space. The Ottoman Empire extended deep into the deserts of Arabia. The one thing that allowed them to supply their beleaguered garrison at Medina was their railway line. This was the only way that they could bring reinforcements or supplies. Lawrence decided to move through that desert and not to attack the fortresses or the troops, but instead to target precisely 1,100 miles of fragile, expensive line and engines in order to cut the spine of that empire. Lawrence would have been carrying about 50 pounds of gelignite, which he needed to get up and under these rails without being seen. That involved him digging out about 50 pounds of sand, placing the fuse underneath, and then trying to set the trigger. Now, the trigger was usually a rifle which had been cut off at the barrel end. As the train moves, the train pulls the trigger, at which point the barrel, which has got a big bullet in it pointing down into the sand, ignites the entire bunch of gelignite. These are the attacks which David Lean enacts so powerfully in his film. Your whole train's blown up, you've no idea what's taking place. Machine gun fire's coming in from that ridge there. You want to get behind here in order to take cover. It's at that point that Lawrence is depending on his mortar fire, which is going to come over the top and try to get them behind the train. But the whole thing is black smoke everywhere. Noise everywhere, pistons exploding, people screaming, trains falling off on either side. And this whole area around us is littered with sick and dying and wounded soldiers. It's complete carnage. And although Lawrence tries to put a brave face on it, he writes to friends saying, "We had a good show, we managed to get it, it was just like the Wild West." In another letter to the friend, he says, "I cannot bear the killing. I cannot bear the sight of these dead men." In many dangerous spots, the Turks would send out patrols in front of their trains, and they would walk 15 people in front of the train to stop them from blowing it up. It was a complete disaster. Understandably, nobody wanted to get on this train anymore. By the end of 1917, passengers on the Damascus-Medina line are paying extra to sit in the third-class carriages at the back of the train, rather than the first-class carriages up near the engine. And a lot of it was to do with terror. It was terrorism, because they would put huge signs up in the train station Damascus anonymously at night, saying, "No good Arabs should get on this train. If you get on this train, we'll blow you up." Very, very similar to what terrorists will do today in Iraq, what they'll do today in Britain. It's to do with trying to ensure not just that you do the damage, but that you scare people into believing you're going to do future damage.
Lawrence was an insurgent. In today's language, the Turks would have regarded him as a terrorist. I think he would have understood what the Taliban were up to, instinctively and objectively on account of his own experience. Wouldn't have any difficulty with that at all.
Little wonder then that when the US military were trying to fight insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan, they turned back to the writings of Lawrence and saw him as a voice for this kind of insurgency. General David Petraeus, who was the American commander in Iraq and is now the commander in Afghanistan, devised a whole new counterinsurgency doctrine, a new field manual, a lot of which draws on Lawrence's writings. One of the co-authors of this was John Nagel.
Downloaded more than 1 million times in the first month after it was published. Copies found in Taliban training camps in Pakistan. So we know our enemies are reading it. Now we just have to get our guys to do it. Lawrence was trying to sap the strength of the Ottoman Empire. He attacked their logistics. He refused to provide them with a set-piece battle, which he knew they would win. And instead, he would inflict the death of 1,000 cuts. And he actually felt sorry for the conventional army he fought. He said he compared it to a plant. It's rooted firmly. It has these long lines of supply. It can't move rapidly. And by comparison, an insurgent is a vapor. An insurgent can disappear at will. It is enormously difficult for a conventional army designed to confront another conventional army to fight against an immaterial vapor. Lawrence actually was using guerrilla tactics and techniques to create a small army of guerrilla fighters. To some extent in Afghanistan, the Taliban is following Lawrence's precepts more precisely.
Are we right that in this sense he's on the side of the enemy?
To succeed in this kind of war, you need to be someone who thinks a little bit outside the box, to use a horribly overused American phrase. You have to be willing to connect with the people you're fighting, who are also the people you're fighting with.
The fundamental challenge for the US forces and their allies in Iraq and Afghanistan are to work with local forces. Lawrence was in the center of an Arab army. He was building the capacity of local troops. Night after night, as he crossed this stony wilderness, he was trying to bring together feuding Arab tribes into a single national fighting force. So Lawrence stops here for the night on his way from Wadi Rum on an attack on a Turkish train station. This is the carpet of brown flints that he describes over a lime scrag. He started the day with about 100 people, and they're all fighting. There's the Zubaydah tribe, the Zalabani tribe, some Hawaitat have joined them. He's running back and forth between these different groups, discussing pay, spoils, who's going to ride first. Come night, they stop, and there are 3 little groups around tamarisk fires, and he's delighted because the day started with 10 different groups and he's managed to get them to combine into 3. But if he's really going to create a new Arab nation, he's got to get them into 1. Lawrence's military genius faced its greatest test at the beginning of 1917. His aim was to work with Auda Abu Tayi, one of the most famous Bedouin warriors in Arabia, a man who couldn't count the number of people that he'd killed. Together with Auda, he decided, without asking permission or even informing his bosses, to head for Aqaba, the Turkish Ottoman port that controlled the Red Sea. It was an astonishing journey, beginning with 17 or 18 people through this remote area of desert. All the skills, his sense of insurgency, his feeling for the tribes came together, as historian Michael Asher, who served in the SAS, explained to me.
It was really the classic Special Forces operation because they made this incredible turning movement through the hardest desert in Arabia. There's one area called Al-Hul, which means the terror, literally, where there's, not a single blade of grass, not a single tree, not even flies could live there. The reason he did that was it was a feint. If he'd made straight towards Aqaba, the Turks would have realized immediately that that was his objective. And just a handful of men, only 17 to start off with, no heavy weapons. They then set about recruiting local people. This is the hearts and minds technique of Special Forces. And they eventually became 500. All Special Forces really go back to Aqaba, to that operation.
The fighting, which in David Lean's film takes place on the Aqaba beaches, in fact took place 60 miles inland, here at Abdalissan.
This was the key point. The Turks here controlled the pass, going down into the Guera Plain. So he who controlled the pass really controlled Aqaba. But it was the topography that really was the key to the battle, because the Turks were down in the depression that we can see here. Lawrence's men were up on the high ground. Basically, the Arabs had them pinned down in this hollow. At the end of the day, after sniping at them virtually the whole day, Lawrence got a bit fed up with the Huwaitat, and he said to Auda Abu Tai, how is it with the Huwaitat? All talk and no work. And Auda, who was very sensitive to these pricks against his honour, turned absolutely pale, and he marched off. And the next minute, Lawrence saw this horde of Huwaitat horsemen charging down into the valley, and he very quickly followed on his camel. But just at the crucial moment, he shot his own camel through the head with his pistol and ended up sailing through the air and hit the ground, lost consciousness, and when he came round, the whole thing was over.
He'd won one of the most crucial ports in the Middle East, and in an instant this map-maker from a desk at Cairo, with his romantic army, had created a legend and proved the worth of the Arab forces.
And the theory of the SAS is that if you get the right man, you can do anything. If you get people like Lawrence who can really understand the way Arabs think, and really see the world as they see it, then you could do it. But of course, it's very difficult to find those kind of people, and that's why I think Lawrence was so special.
It wasn't enough for Lawrence to capture this important strategic port, because of course British headquarters underestimated the Arabs. He needed now to communicate their victory back to Cairo.
There were no telephones, no telegraph. The only way to do it was to take the news personally, by camel, across the Sinai to Suez, and then to Cairo. Now, Lawrence had to do that himself because he realized that if he sent someone, no one would believe him, because this wasn't an authorized operation. Nobody knew where Lawrence was. Where had he been for all these weeks? Nobody knew. So if an Arab had turned up and said, we've captured Aqaba, no one would have believed him. Lawrence knew he had to do it in person. So he set off on this epic ride across Sinai.
When Lawrence had left Cairo 6 months earlier, he'd been a junior British officer in British military uniform. Nobody had heard from him in 2 months. And during his time with the Bedouin, he'd changed into a very different person. On that tough journey back across Sinai, he was travelling back to the British military headquarters, the headquarters in Cairo, and a world which he must half have forgotten.
When Lawrence staggered exhausted after that heroic ride into the edge of the British base in Cairo, he somehow managed to get in to see General Allenby. The contrast between Allenby, a cavalry officer, tall, a product of the Victorian Army in his polished riding boots, and as Lawrence says of himself, a little silk-robed, barefooted man offering to hobble the enemy, couldn't have been more dramatic. And yet it was a meeting of minds.
Allenby immediately decided to provide armoured cars, machine guns, mortars and compasses to help the Arab cause. Allenby could see that a man like Lawrence was exactly the person who could form the right wing of his army, lead them against the Ottoman Turks. For Lawrence, however, a different kind of challenge was emerging. He suddenly had two masters, Allenby and Faisal. He was hoping he could win a victory for General Allenby and for the British, and for Faisal an independent Arab kingdom. All of this, of course, was going to depend on what was decided in Britain. Would the British government keep its promise to give the Arabs the independence and freedom, to give the Arabs the respect and the autonomy that Lawrence felt they deserved? While Lawrence was continuing his fight in the deserts of Arabia, far away, back in Whitehall, the British and the French had in fact secretly decided to betray the Arabs, and instead of giving Faisal an independent kingdom, to divide Arabia up into British and French colonies. The French negotiator in all of this was Georges Picot. The British negotiator was Sir Mark Sykes. Together they decided to divide Arabia into two imperial possessions. I talked to historian James Barr about the significance of the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
The reason Sykes was brought in as an expert was because he'd written a book on the Ottoman Empire just before the war. And if you look in the index of that book, which Sykes wrote, he has an entry for Arab character, and it says, Arab character, see also treachery. And that was Sykes's view. It was a deal done to carve up the Middle East between these two empires, between Britain and France. What it did was divide the Middle East along a diagonal line that ran from the Mediterranean coast up to the Persian border, from the E of Acre to the last K in Kirkuk,
right,
which gives you this wonderful idea of, you know, how it was designed on a map. There was no, it bore no relation to geography or to ethnicity or religion. It was simply a line on the map. It was a very complacent and arrogant thing to do. It was dividing up a land that neither of them yet ran. And one of the British officials in the War Office said it's a bit like being hunters who divided up the skin of the bear before we have killed it.
So Lawrence knew that the British and French were actually planning to divide Arabia up into colonies. How do you think this felt for Lawrence to have to be with the Arabs, to promise them this kind of freedom, while knowing that the same thing had been promised in other directions at the same time?
He's absolutely appalled, and he writes a note to his commanding officer when he's deep in the desert, saying, we are getting them to fight for us on a lie, and I can't stand it.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement is the deal that's seldom discussed in Britain today. But the Arabs have certainly not forgotten it, because it was a treaty that betrayed all the promises that Lawrence and the British government had made to the Arabs.
And worse, something that was going to haunt Middle Eastern politics for decades to come. When Osama bin Laden talks about the nature of his mission, when he thinks about Lawrence of Arabia,
he thinks about the betrayal of Sykes-Picot and calls it, in his words, the dissection of the Islamic world into fragments. Next, I want to show how Lawrence tries to reverse the injustice of Sykes-Picot, how he tries to use his fame and his military glory to win a fair settlement for the Arabs, and how the legacy of that conflict destroyed both Lawrence and our future relations with the Middle East. In this church in rural Dorset is one of my heroes, a man on whose death Churchill said, I fear, whatever our need, we shall not see his like again. An Englishman who will forever be connected to the deserts of Arabia. Lawrence is best known from the Hollywood blockbuster, where he's played by Peter O'Toole as an eccentric, intense, young, blonde Englishman leading an Arab army in a First World War revolt against the Ottoman Turks. Today, Lawrence has an extraordinary new relevance. Before American officers are posted to Iraq and Afghanistan on their own desert campaigns, they're made to study Lawrence. They see Lawrence as the man who cracked how to fight in the Middle East.
But there's another chapter of his life which we know much less about. He returned from the battles in Arabia to a different kind of fight, a fight in the cabinet rooms in Downing Street, the Palace of Versailles.
Lawrence called this his dogfight in the corridors of power. But unlike his battles in Arabia, this was a fight he lost.
Shukran, Saidi. Aish al-Iraq.
His His political vision for Arabia was ignored, and this has poisoned our relations with the Middle East ever since.
He was a man of vision. Unfortunately, not many people were willing to listen to him after 1918. Had they were, much of the crisis that we're facing today would not have happened.
In this film, I want to show how Lawrence's campaign to reshape the Middle East is the forgotten chapter in his story. Its failure ultimately destroyed him, and it continues to haunt us in Iraq and Afghanistan today.
I first heard about Lawrence when I was about 6. I was living in Malaysia, and when my father took me walking in the jungle, every time I complained about being thirsty, he'd say, "Lawrence of Arabia went for 3 days through the desert without food or water."
As I grew older, I often thought about Lawrence as a warrior hero. Then, in 2003, after the invasion of Iraq, I became the deputy governor of 2 Iraqi provinces.
Gathered in this room are the fathers and the mothers of the new province.
I was living in Amara, a town where Lawrence had stayed 90 years earlier. Like him, I was a young British official involved in another British occupation in Iraq. There, in a Muslim town but surrounded by foreign soldiers, I began to read his journalism and letters. I suddenly discovered Lawrence, not as some kind of desert warrior in a Hollywood movie, but instead as a journalist, criticizing the British government's intervention in Iraq in 1920, in which he said, "The people of England have been led in Iraq into a trap from which it will be hard to escape with dignity and honor. It's a disgrace to our imperial record. We are today not far from disaster." He was writing about events in Iraq in 1920.
Find hard cover, everyone.
But to me, he was describing the insanity and indignity of what I saw around me in 2003. Before Lawrence comes to these conclusions on Britain's intervention in Iraq, he's embroiled in a dramatic First World War military campaign. Lawrence isn't fighting in the mud of Flanders, but in the deserts of Arabia, not in tanks, but on camels. Lawrence has been sent by the British to weld Arab tribes into an army capable of overthrowing their occupiers, the Ottoman Turks, who are now allied with the Germans and who threaten Britain's empire in the east. But gradually Lawrence finds he's serving 2 masters. As a British officer, he's pursuing the aims of the British Empire with British guns and British money. But he's also living with and trying to serve Arabs, whose only objective is a free, independent Arabia, whose capital is Damascus.
Damascus was central to Lawrence's vision for Arabia. Damascus is the dream palace. Damascus represents for him the great age of Arab independence, one of the greatest cities of the world. In his words, one of the 7 pillars of wisdom. For Arab civilization, the seat of the first great Arab empire. All of this, and of course the wealth of the surrounding countryside, was what made it essential for Lawrence and for the Arab movement to put Damascus at their heart, to make this incredibly cosmopolitan, sophisticated city the capital of their new empire, rather than wastelands of desert Arabia.
Lawrence's allies are not a formal army. They're insurgents, one might almost say terrorists, using propaganda, the support of the local population, to launch swift and devastating raids. Their principal target was not the Ottoman soldiers, but instead the fragile rail track, which was the spine of the Ottoman Empire, linking their headquarters at Damascus to their garrison of Medina.
This is an Ottoman Turkish railway station. It's really a fortified blockhouse. 200 or 300 Turkish soldiers would have been in this station, defending this section of the line. There's something about this which is incredibly desperate. Somebody's just smashed through in order to create this split hole because this window is too dangerous. I mean, you can feel almost the speed and the desperation that have gone into hacking in this to create your firing position. Lawrence talks a lot about creeping up on these kinds of places. As you get within about 300 yards crawling through the sand, you can see coming through, presumably windows like this, the light of the cooking fires. A man walks out to light a cigarette, and the light briefly illuminates his face. He sees it's a hollow-faced, pale-faced young officer. And as Lawrence says, as long as he could keep those soldiers in the blockhouses poking their rifles out of those slits, that was all they were ever going to command. 150 yards around a station like this, while the other 100,000 square miles of desert stretching out here to Saudi Arabia was his. The Arab army moved across the gravel and the sands as though across a limitless ocean. As Lawrence said, the Arabs might be a vapor. The Arabs were now the right wing of a massive British-led advance. The two forces were driving north through the Negev desert in parallel, the Arabs on the right, the British on the left. By December 1917, they'd reached Jerusalem. General Allenby, commander of the British forces in the east, invited Lawrence to march with the soldiers into the city. Lawrence had been obsessed with Crusader Knights since he was a boy. It was a moment of enormous significance. The Holy Land reclaimed for the first time since the Crusades. This is the Jaffa Gate, the old city of Jerusalem. It's the Conqueror's Gate. So when General Allenby conquers the city in 1917, it's through this gate that he marches with Lawrence behind him. Lawrence has swapped his Arab clothes for the correct uniform of a British officer, British major. And they're marching instead of riding horses because Christ walked into the old city of Jerusalem. It was for Lawrence the supreme moment of the war, that's what he calls it. So the British had won a glorious military victory. But what did it mean? What was their long-term plan? Where was this going? Who was going to get Jerusalem? Who was going to get Arabia? Lawrence had heard that in a secret deal, British and French politicians had created something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Lawrence had promised the Arabs that in return for their support, they could have a fully independent Arab kingdom. But in fact, the British and French had decided to carve Arabia up into colonies. Lawrence had hoped that he could both be a good British officer and serve the Arab cause. But as he changed from his British uniform back into Arab dress, these competing loyalties were tearing him apart. This is Lawrence's bedroom, the winter from 1917 to 1918. And he felt that this whole fort was imbued with memories. As he walked through it, he could feel in these lava stones memories of the Roman legionaries for whom this was the outpost on the edge of the great desert that led to the Euphrates. and the legends of all the later Arab kings, their chivalry, their crimes, their wandering. And he gathered here what was really a second medieval court. Out in the courtyard, prancing up and down day after day, were different Bedouin tribes coming out of the hills, bringing gifts, laying out silk robes, elaborately sewn felt carpets. All of this a lavish reenactment of a court. He's living a life like King Arthur in his court at Camelot. He has his 30th birthday just near here. People are beginning to believe his own legend. Allenby's believing it, his British friends are believing it, his family's believing it. Even the Arabs are beginning to believe that he's a world historical figure. He's another Alexander the Great. He, however, is aware of failure. He feels like a fraud. He's trying to sit here like a prophet in the desert, sharing a creed of freedom. But he's not a prophet, and he doesn't have any freedom to offer. At this period, Lawrence's military actions become increasingly desperate and suicidal. He leaves a note for his commanding officer saying, "We've asked them to fight on a lie, and I can't stand it." Lawrence concludes, the only option is to rush the Arab army to Damascus. Meanwhile, the British are advancing. The Ottomans are fighting them back with increasing ferocity. The Arabs are working their way around the Turkish troops. There's brutality. There are some horrendous massacres. The race is on. He wants the Arabs in Damascus before the British. If the Arabs are going to have any hope of claiming an independent kingdom, any hope of saying, there's no need for a British colony here, there's no need for a French colony here, we've managed to grab Damascus. Lawrence broke with his British masters and confessed to Faisal that the Sykes-Picot Agreement would divide Arabia into colonies. Lawrence wrote, Faisal's escape would be to help the British so much that after the peace they would not be able for shame to shoot him down. By the autumn of 1918, Faisal's dream was tantalizingly close as the Turkish army fled Damascus. Lawrence and the Arab army slipped into the city on the morning of October the 1st, 1918, just before the British army. Lawrence arrived in Damascus wearing flowing Arab robes, but riding in a British Rolls-Royce. So it's here that finally Lawrence achieves his victory, and it's a moment of astonishing euphoria. He comes into these crowded streets. He estimates 150,000 people are around. There are rose petals being thrown on the ground. They're shouting, Lawrence, 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 but it's also a moment of chaos. The old regime has fled, the water supply has collapsed, the electricity has collapsed, the sewerage has collapsed. Bodies are lying in the streets, festering corpses in the hospitals. This strange, fragile European man in his white silk gowns is grabbing people in this market, grabbing them and trying to stop them from looting, trying to stop the gunfire which is rocketing up and down these roofs above. Here, in this Ottoman souk, almost unchanged from the moment at which you can see it, you can see both the bullet fire on the roof and the sense of that teeming hubbub of crowds, which Lawrence, travel-stained, exhausted in his white robes, is trying to move through and grab people and control. For centuries, Damascus had been under Ottoman control, and suddenly it had collapsed. It was a nation without law and government. In the province in which I served in Iraq just after the invasion, literally every school had been stripped. All the electricity pylons were down. It was this frenzy of looting that everybody in 2003 thought was so unexpected. The Americans claimed to be surprised by it, but in fact, we'd seen it again and again. It's what, of course, Lawrence saw in 1918. As the dusk finally fell, on that first night in Damascus, Lawrence, who'd slept maybe 3 hours and 3 days, heard a man from a minaret begin to sing the call to prayer in a very soft, sweet and gentle voice. And he sung, Allahu Akbar, Allah ilallah, Muhammad Rasulallah, God is great, there's no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet. And then he dropped his voice a couple of tones and very gently added, and he is very good to us tonight, O people of Damascus. But for Lawrence, he was aware of all the compromises of Sykes-Picot. He was aware that Syria was probably about to be sold out to the French, and that what seemed to be to the people of Damascus a night of perfect freedom was maybe just a mirage. Lawrence was gambling that once Faisal was established in Damascus, it would be impossible for the British and French to topple him or replace him. For Syrian historian Sami Mubayed, Faisal was undoubtedly popular with the people.
Lawrence came in on October the 1st, Faisal followed on October 3rd. He was hailed as a savior.
In a sense, Lawrence's confidence in Faisal was vindicated. His belief that this was an appropriate ruler was correct.
Faisal had legitimacy, being a grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. Faisal had his war medals, having fought in the Arab Revolt of 1916. Lawrence was able to witness the sense of revolution that he had inspired and ignited in the Arabs. Definitely these people were not going to accept French rule so easily.
So what were the French doing? I mean, why did they want Syria?
I'd hate to say it, it's pure colonial ambitions and reward for territory. French blood had been spilled in World War I, and there had to be a certain reward, and there was still a strong sense of French and British colonialism and expansionist tendencies.
وقت اجى على الشام وين كان ينام؟ قلب منطقة الشعلان كان. هذا فيكتوريا اوتيل اسمه اوتيل فيكتوريا هون هذا محل البناء هذا.
So it's the train station. So it must have been straight down from the train station. Somewhere in this bustling modern city of Damascus is the site of the Victoria Hotel, where Lawrence held one of the most important meetings of his life. You're saying it's not the one at the corner, but it's around the corner on the right. Okay, very good. So I think with the translator to help me, I tried to find the exact spot of this encounter.
This area, it's all called Victoria because of the bridge and the hotel.
This was the Great Hotel down from the train station where Lawrence hosted the historic meeting between his two masters, General Allenby and Prince Faisal.
Victoria.
Victoria, Al-Qijab building, Victoria. So we think roughly here where the bridge was.
Yes.
It was an extraordinary scene. The Turkish soldiers had vanished, and suddenly the streets of Damascus were full of Arabs on horses, and the British in armored vehicles.
Here, the site of the Hotel Victoria, Lawrence's two lives came hurtling together. Rolling down this avenue came Allenby, the commander of the British forces, and Faisal, the leader of the Arab revolt. This was a moment that Lawrence must both have been looking forward to, but also dreading. He'd been spinning stories to both of them. To Allenby, he kept trying to convince him that working with the Arabs was going to be the way to defeat the Ottomans and ultimately contribute to defeating the Germans. To Faisal, he'd been suggesting that this was the way to win Arab freedom. This great grand ambition, where Lawrence is trying to be a Mahatma Gandhi. He's trying to be a Mandela. He's trying to lead an independence movement, and this is where he finds out whether it's going to work. What happened in that room, we don't really know. But what we do know is that Lawrence was asked to translate by Allenby the terms of a Foreign Office telegram that laid out the Sykes-Picot Agreement. End of the meeting, the telegram's been read. Faisal walks out, or according to some people, storms out. Here, the the site of the Hotel Victoria, perhaps fittingly now demolished, was the beginning of most of the suspicion and recrimination between the Middle East and Britain that has plagued the area for the next 90 years. For Lawrence, Damascus was, and should have been, the capital of an independent Arab empire. But there in the Hotel Victoria, he'd seen that the British and the French wanted to create colonies. He said to the French, "You can cling on for 20 years if you like, pretending to have a colony, but in the end you'll be thrown out with no gratitude from anyone." The strain of this realization was immense. One of the strangest things about what Lawrence does in Damascus on his very final day is that he has this portrait painted. After all the chaos in the souk, the bullets, the politics with Faisal, he sits in a chair for James McBay, the Scottish portrait artist, who describes watching him impassive as sheikh after sheikh comes in to kiss his hand in tears to say goodbye. This should have been the great moment of victory. This should be a portrait of a victorious general. Instead of which you can see these sunken cheeks, and actually he's already taken on an air of somebody who's haunted. The following day, Lawrence left Damascus. He returned to London from the war shattered and weighing just 7 stone. Above all, he needed rest. But instead, he dedicated the next 4 years to another fight, working in every way he could to establish the independence of Arabia. When Lawrence came back to London in the winter 1918, he was in a completely different environment. It wasn't just the winter British weather. He was dealing with men who were debating in the Houses of Parliament what must have seemed to them much bigger issues. Bolshevik Russia, the threat of communism, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Compared to all of this, the Middle East and Lawrence's concerns must have seemed just like a sideshow of a sideshow. Lawrence's enemies suggested that he'd gone native, that he cared only about Arab interests. But in fact, he grasped that colonies in Arabia would not suit Britain or France. He saw that the West lacked the power, the knowledge, and the legitimacy to control other people's countries. He wrote, "My ambition is that the Arabs should be our first brown dominion, not our last brown colony." He saw that Arabs could and should govern themselves. I put this idea to historian James Barr. Lawrence seems to be saying, let's not set up a colony here. Let's have a dominion. In other words, let's try to treat Arabia as though it was like Canada or Australia. This sounds a bit ahead of his time.
It's completely ahead of its time. Lawrence acknowledges there should be British influence, which is when he's talking about the Arabs being our first brown dominion. There is a relationship with the British, and the British will provide advice, when it's wanted. He sees the two as allies. He thinks that he can achieve what Lloyd George wants, which is a bridgehead in the Middle East, but he can do so through the Arabs being allies rather than being subjects.
In order to achieve his goal, Lawrence uses all his reputation, all his contacts, to get Faisal a seat at the Paris Peace Conference at Versailles. It's a chance to meet the most famous and influential statesman in the world, a chance for Faisal to present his case, and Lawrence was there with him all the time as his advisor. Lawrence walks into the most extraordinary scene. The great statesmen of Britain, France and America have gathered essentially to carve up the world between them. Delegations are swarming in. All the seeds, in fact, of the chaos in Europe for the next 60 years is being laid here in the Palace of Versailles, and the Middle East is coming into it too. He was probably the most colourful figure in the whole conference, in his British colonel's uniform, with his Arab headdress, walking around with Faisal. He's been trying to convince the British and the Arabs that the best thing is to have an independent Arabia. And suddenly he's dealing with the French. So it's a little bit as though you were a British official in Iraq. You don't have to only think about what the Iraqis want or what's in the interests of Britain. You have to think about the United States today. And for Lawrence, the equivalent is the French, a big superpower that's just come out of the First World War. He's gambling that he can break the agreement that the British made with the French. He can break the Sykes-Picot agreement. He can convince the French that it doesn't make any sense for them to try to make a colony in Arabia. It would be better to have an independent state. In a way, I suppose the problem for Lawrence is he's there too late. What he doesn't quite understand is that while all these minutes are being written and all the civil servants are fiddling on the details on the map, the real thing that's happened is that Clemenceau, the French leader, has sat down with Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, and had a conversation that's lasted about an hour, in which basically everything's been resolved a year before any agreement's signed. Clemenceau says to Lloyd George, "What do you want?" And Lloyd George says, "I'd like Mosul in northern Iraq for the oil, and I'd like Palestine." And Clemenceau says, "Done." And in return, Lloyd George basically says, well, the French can have what they want in Syria. Lawrence calls his time in Paris the worst months of his life. It's the first time he's really seen politics up front. He was used to being a hero. For 2.5 years in the desert, British officers, British government officials saw him as this amazingly romantic figure. Suddenly, it was all changing. As he began to get involved in politics, he became an embarrassment. He couldn't get into meetings with ministers, and suddenly telegrams are flying around saying, "Lawrence is out of control, get him out of Paris." At the bottom of all of it, though, is the sense that all his gambles have failed. And in the middle of all this failure and all this shame, which he must have felt very seriously, he gets a very compassionate letter from Rudyard Kipling. Kipling writes to him and says, "Lawrence, if you don't do what they want you to do, you will be considered, from the Foreign Office point of view, the worst kind of crook. Pretty soon, I expect, they will accuse you of having been motivated by finance in all that you did." And then Kipling tries to encourage him. He says, "But you'll stick with the game, except for the necessary time to step aside and vomit. Because you are young, and the men who are running affairs are old, cold, of intolerable entrails, and they'll drop out soon.
The just demands of peace and security will be met.
The modern equivalent of the Versailles Peace Conference is this: the General Assembly of the United Nations. This is where the resolutions on Iraq and Afghanistan were debated and passed. I've come here to meet Khan Ross, who, like Lawrence, tried to challenge the policies of the great powers. Khan was the Iraq expert on the British delegation to the United Nations. After the 2003 invasion, Khan resigned, believing that the evidence on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction didn't justify the war. Khan, like Lawrence, is an example of what can happen when a British official tries to point out that a policy is wrong.
Here we were in the UN, this forum of the international community saying we're committed to a peaceful route, committed to inspections, as I was instructed to say for many years. And in fact, we were privately, secretly, preparing to do something entirely different.
And we will accept no outcome but victory.
To be frank, I found it a deeply disillusioning and embittering experience, one that I'm still struggling with. A country that I believed in and values that I believed in. And when I saw that undermined, I suppose, to put it mildly, I felt very lost. And I think I was naive about it because I think states often behave in that way. And ultimately, my conclusion is one of deep skepticism of the state system and indeed this place.
Kipling writes Lawrence to console him, saying, "You're going to be attacked by the Foreign Office, and you will be considered as the worst kind of crook. They're going to accuse you of being motivated by venal incentives."
Yeah, I know all about that.
But you're young, and you won't step out of the game except for the necessary moment to step aside and vomit, get back in the game. Because these men are old, cold, and of intolerable entrails, and you'll outlast them. What's your reaction when you hear that kind of advice?
Well, I think it's remarkable that he said that, because that's actually very perceptive of what it is. I'm sure he felt that in some way he'd been used as part of a betrayal of people he felt passionately committed to. And I suspect also he felt lost. He must have been asking himself, where next, what now?
The pain that Khan so clearly feels suggested to me what it must have felt like for Lawrence, a sense that in breaking from the British government, so many dreams and ideals had been destroyed, that Lawrence was on the edge of a personal breakdown. When Lawrence returns to Oxford, his mother describes him sitting for hours at a time, unmoving, his face frozen, staring at the ground. Hannah Arendt, great intellectual, commenting on Lawrence at this period, says, "Never again was the experiment of secret politics made more purely by a more decent man. The imperialists destroyed Lawrence, till nothing was left but some inexplicable decency." There was nowhere for Lawrence to hide, because here, at London's Covent Garden, he was being transformed into a major star. Ironically, at the very moment when Lawrence was being seen by his own colleagues as an unreliable, ill-informed man, when he was feeling at Versailles that people no longer respected him, he was being transformed into a major international celebrity. Lowell Thomas, an American journalist who'd been with him in the desert, took to Covent Garden a show with Lawrence and Arabia, which drew in over 1 million people in a few months. Lawrence became basically the largest international celebrity before Charlie Chaplin. For a moment he thought he could use this, that somehow this kind of fame would be something that would allow him to promote the Arab cause, get freedom for Arabia. But what he learned, and I think many celebrities have learned since, is that it's self-consuming. It didn't really achieve anything political. In the end, it's celebrity, fame for fame's sake. To counter this, Lawrence felt compelled to produce his own account of that desert campaign. He started work on what would eventually become the 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Here at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, I'm being allowed a look at the manuscripts of Lawrence's book with Richard Ovenden, keeper of the special collections.
Well, this rather unusual object, it is the final version in manuscript of the Seven Pillars. The myth of Lawrence, partly self-created, has reached such a pitch, and the literary world knows that this text is nascent and they want to read it.
There's a sense that this is a monument. This is like leaving behind some great brass tomb.
Yes. How do you achieve that, if you like, immortality through your text? And here you can see some of that, almost to my mind, anguish laid out on the page.
Yeah, thanks. In a way, his prose is the weakest part of the whole thing. He's obsessed with a certain kind of slushy, late 19th century decadent poetry. With cool head and tranquil judgment, imperturbably conscious of the flight, they oscillated from asymptote to asymptote. Now, it's absolutely unclear to me what on earth he's going on about when he talks about the asymptote to asymptote. Bernard Shaw writes him and says, Lawrence, he says, you are as little to be trusted with a pen as a child with a torpedo. As Lawrence was writing his book, Britain was expanding its presence in the Middle East. While the French were struggling to take control of Syria, the British had moved into the oil-rich province of Iraq. Their increasing occupation now faced an insurgency. The tribes of the Euphrates were rising against them. The British were dropping bombs and gas. Back in his London flat, Lawrence was appalled by the hypocrisy, the cruelty, and the senselessness of the whole British occupation. He began to use every element of his public fame, and to the fury of his colleagues, wrote letters to the Times denouncing the British occupation. These are the letters that I came across when I moved to Iraq in 2003 as part of another British occupation. In those, they will count exactly how many votes each candidate had. I spent almost a year as the deputy governor of 2 provinces, holding elections, trying to bring some semblance of order and prepare the country for independence. And from this day is the real beginning of the transition to a free, independent Iraq. And yet outside the compound, we were facing an insurgency. Thousands of Iraqis were demonstrating outside our buildings day after day. I was under siege with rockets and mortar shells flying in. Initially, I had thought that we could do some good, but the longer I spent there, the more I realized how little we knew, how little we could do, how little the Iraqis wanted us there. And I began to see Lawrence as a prophet who had predicted this situation. I admire Lawrence for his articles in the newspapers as a journalist, where he reveals a much, much more radical mind. This is the Times, Friday, July 23rd, 1920. This week's debate in the Commons on the Middle East, a veteran of the House expressed surprise the Arabs of Mesopotamia were in arms against us, despite our well-made mandate. So here we are in Iraq in 1920, and it's the same situation, roughly, that we have in 2003. People are complaining about Iraq. They don't know how to get out. They don't know what to do about it. And Lawrence writes in a letter, a remedy, ? I can see a cure only in immediate change of policy. I would make Arabic the government language. I would make the Arabs do the work. They can. I would cause to leave the country every single British soldier, and we should then hold of Mesopotamia exactly as much or as little as we hold of South Africa or Canada. It's there, it's these letters in which you see the grandeur of Lawrence's vision. Lawrence in those letters seems to be saying, get out, you shouldn't be there. That sentiment is exactly what took me back to Iraq in early 2009. I'm here with the US military,
but hoping to get a sense of what the Iraqi people feel will be the legacy of this foreign intervention.
We're going to pop out and load weapons.
Without further ado, let's roll. I mean, you're free to talk to anyone you want, so...
That's great. Then you don't really need to know that information.
On this road, about a year ago, there was a car bomb about 500 meters down that road. And really up until about three months ago, you didn't see as many people out on this road. The best thing is go out with my soldiers every day and see that there is a difference being made.
And how much of a sense of the politics have you got here?
I don't have a great understanding of it.
And do you know, for example, who all these people are in this picture?
I don't know all of them now.
So let's see if we can find somebody who wants to talk. Some of them are a bit apprehensive,
As you can
understandably.
see, once we get down to the
yeah.
middle
Ooh, Yanni, let's have a look at this. Can we ask him? What would you like? What do the people want in this area?
First, the U.S. Army troops pull out.
Should leave. And then things will get better?
Of course.
What has been the cause of the violence for the last 5 years?
The Americans.
What was the main reason for the resistance against the United States and Britain?
So that's what can you do if somebody capture your house? So the resistance is aiming for one goal, get American troops out.
You're British? I'm British. From Scotland. Scotland.
So that's you invade our country too.
I know, it's true. It's true. I sense some frustration when there was this kind of guy standing in the market saying, American troops out, they've done nothing for us.
Well, I mean, I think it is frustrating, but the fact that he's able to do that is, I think, a sign that we've accomplished a great deal here. But ultimately, we're not here for to get cheers from the people or anything like that. We're just here to provide security.
American officers study Lawrence in order to learn how to deal with Arabs. But Lawrence saw there's something fundamentally alien and unworkable about the relationship between foreign troops and a local population. No matter the first motivations for an intervention, Lawrence saw that for very deep reasons, a sustained occupation like this cannot work.
Lawrence says the foreigner and Christian is not a popular person in Arabia. You know, remember, however friendly and informal your relations may seem to be, the foundations are very sandy ones.
I can understand what he's saying there. I think the heart of it is we'll never quite fit in here. That I know where he's coming from. And at the end of the day, we're two different type of people. We're two different cultures.
There clearly was a knot of people in the center of that bazaar who perceived this as an occupation. And that, I think, was Lawrence's insight. That however much you do to try to overcome these cultural divides, in the end, it's not your country. You don't have the knowledge, you don't have the power, but most importantly of all, you don't have the consent of the people.
I've come from the market to a private home in Baghdad to talk to Ali Alawi, a famous Iraqi intellectual and Minister for Trade and Defense in the Iraqi government after the fall of Saddam.
I mean, like, you know, any person who doesn't really belong in your family sort of walks in and sits, and he may come and paint the house, right, and, you know, fix the bathrooms, but he basically doesn't belong here. But guests they overstay their welcome, they become unwelcome. And I think Lawrence would have appreciated that. He would have understood that the West can only help, guide, point out, advise, well-meaning and well-intentioned. But ultimately, we have to come up with our own formula.
What would be the lesson from this for American foreign policy for the next 20 years?
I think fools rush in where angels fear to tread. I mean, I don't think they'd embark on this for a very long time. It's not every day that you mobilize 200,000 people, spend $2-3 trillion. But all else being equal, I think it will be seen as a curious episode with momentous consequences.
3 years after the end of the First World War, it was clear that foreign colonial occupation was not working. The British were facing a revolution in Iraq. The French had been forced to throw Faisal out of Syria and were not sure what to do next. Winston Churchill, as colonial secretary, asked Lawrence to advise him at a conference in Cairo. Lawrence's advice was to give much more independence to the Arabs. Faisal, who had been thrown out of Syria by the French, was now imposed in Iraq as the king of a British-supported state. The British provided advisors and some support for economic development. Nevertheless, the whole situation for the Arabs was a humiliation. The start of World War I, they had been promised a vast, independent Arab kingdom, with its capital at Damascus. But by 1921, they were left with a patchwork of disparate new nations, not technically British and French colonies, but under British and French control nevertheless. Lawrence claimed to be satisfied with the solution, but I believe it was a pretty hollow claim, and it showed how far his ambitions had been beaten down by the political process. Here in Jordan is the Martyrs Memorial Museum, which celebrates the Great Arab Revolt. But most ironically of all, in that whole museum, there's no mention of Lawrence at all. And that's almost, I think, how he would have liked it. In order for something to be left behind, Lawrence believed it needed to feel Arab, that the role of foreigners had to be concealed. The Arabs had looked to Lawrence to deliver a mighty Arab kingdom, but what they were left with bore little resemblance to what Lawrence had promised. This small country, Jordan, is almost the last surviving fragment of Lawrence's dream, a stable, pro-British kingdom still ruled by Faisal's family. But even here, there's a reluctance to acknowledge Lawrence at all. Such is the lingering suspicion of his motives. I discussed this with Kamal Abu Jaber, the former foreign minister of Jordan, in the capital, Amman.
The history of the Arab world from that time on has been an agonized, traumatized history.
Yeah.
A history of a bitter people with a wounded nationalism.
Yes.
Okay. And they sometimes it's like somebody you hit on the head with a very blunt instrument. You can't see right from wrong. I think the Arabs are still in that stage. And I am not anti-Western or anti-British or anything like that. But the Western betrayal, it really still rankles in the Arab psyche until today. This is the age where the Western countries succeeded in dividing the Arab world and in demolishing literally the hopes of the Arabs.
Across the border in Syria, the animosity is even stronger. Syria was Lawrence's nightmare. His friend Faisal was expelled, and the French, contrary to all his advice, embarked on 20 years of ultimately disastrous colonial rule. All of this has affected Arab perceptions not only of Sykes-Picot, but also of men such as Lawrence. I discussed this with Syrian historian Sami Mubayed.
Syria was the mother country that everything else was carved out of. That's why it still has a major drain on people's minds. Generation after another has been taught from grade school to know fully well about Sykes-Picot and to despise Sykes-Picot.
What's your reaction when you hear the name Lawrence?
I personally am not too fond of the character. I think the character has, his image has been inflated by historians, romanticized by Orientalists. He was a British officer. He was serving his nation's best interests. He was in no way a hero or a champion for the Arabs. But at the end of the day, he was one of the many foreigners who came to this part of the world, who had their hallmark, but he definitely does not deserve the entire homage that you see nowadays.
Lawrence then is rejected by the Arabs. His legacy in Syria, in Jerusalem, in Jordan, is one of suspicion, of uncertainty. He shows the limits of these kinds of foreign military occupation. He was never forgiven by the Arabs, and in a sense, he never forgave himself. In Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the U.S. Army Staff College, however, Lawrence is presented in a very different light. Every officer at this elite institution is made to read Lawrence. I saw photographs of Lawrence behind officers' desks, and he is on their syllabus. I've been invited here to reflect on my experiences in the Middle East and to discuss Lawrence's legacy.
I have the distinct privilege of introducing our speaker today, the renowned Scottish author Rory Stewart.
I'm very interested in Lawrence because he seems to be finding a new kind of relevance. Now, of course, we're using Lawrence as a sort of poster boy of what might be involved in cross-cultural understanding or interaction with people. He himself became increasingly skeptical as his life went on about what this actually meant. By 1920, he was writing letters saying, "Do not try to occupy Mesopotamia." What Lawrence might be an emblem of is what it might be better not to try to do, because things have changed since the time, for example, of Lawrence of Arabia. Have got any thoughts on that?
You know, it's that old thing of, well, I'm doing it for your own good. If the people aren't supporting you, then you have to question how much good you're doing.
We're now in a situation in which the people on the ground, they're not going to put up with you, not necessarily because of what you're doing, not necessarily because you're bad at your job, but simply because you're a foreigner.
I'm not sure, here at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, or even when speaking to British Army officers, that Lawrence's message really gets through. They appear still to perceive him as a romantic figure, as an inspiration for their work. I put this to American historian Don Wright.
In the education provided to majors, Lawrence is offered as an example of this success. The warrior, and Lawrence is a warrior, there's no doubt about it. That appeals. That's the part that appeals to the American Army officer. They are doers. They are men and women of action. What you don't get is the ambivalence that he had about what he was doing.
Lawrence never returned to Arabia again. He lost contact with Faisal. He separated himself from grand friends such as Churchill and turned his back on his past at Oxford. He did not live out his life as a Bedouin prince surrounded by the camels and the warriors and the tents of desert Arabia. Instead of the grandeur of the cliffs of Wadi Rum, he retired to a small cottage in Dorset.
Probably the strangest thing about Lawrence, for me at least, is that when he returned from the war, he chose to enlist as a private in the Air Force. And originally his friends thought this was just a stunt, that he was just going to keep it going for a few months. It lasted for nearly 14 years. During that period, when people were expecting him to come back and, if not become Prime Minister, at least govern a colony or become a general, he was performing menial tasks as a quartermaster or as a telegraph operator. It was a breakdown, and there are many reasons for that breakdown. Perhaps most important is the political, because Lawrence felt that his life was a failure. And the lesson for us today lies in that. He saw something horrifying about the encounter between countries like Britain and the United States and Arabia. He would not have wanted his legacy today to be American or British officers running around with the 7 pillars of wisdom thinking that behaving like Lawrence was the way to do these kinds of occupations better. Lawrence didn't become a colonial officer, didn't become a general, because he realized that there was no way just by fiddling around, by playing with the tactics, you were going to be able to make this into a successful operation.
I am from Arab world. I have message for Mr. Bush and Mr. Tony Blair. You are liars.
Looking at Iraq and Afghanistan today, I believe very strongly that Lawrence's message would have been not do it better, do it more sensitively, but don't do it at all.